The town that disappeared. I grew up in the small town of Swanson Valley in the mountainous region of Northern America. Life was very different when you're so far away from well-developed cities, but the charm of my hometown was its serene simplicity. We worked for our essential needs and enjoyed the fruits of our labor in peace. However, not all the memories of my former home are bright and positive. Along with my cherished childhood recollections is the most horrifying experience that is forever etched in my memory. The bizarre tragedy that befell in Swanson Valley was enough to erase it from the surface of the earth, and the only remaining proof that this town had once existed is me. It happened around the year 1992. I was just a 12-year-old. My mother and I were picking up vegetables from our yard, and the town folks were passing by while saying their morning greetings with a smile. The pastor also dropped by and tapped my head while reminding me to attend the church. My friends and I preferred to play in the woods during Sundays when everyone was gathered in the chapel. We were a bunch of curious and bored kids who often got in trouble. Everything was just as plain as how it usually was. The community of Swanson Valley was very small. There were only around 100 residents in this place, and everyone practically knew each other. The elders of the town, especially the pastor, were quite tolerant of our mischievous behaviors. My best friend Thomas was living right next to our house, and his family often spent their time with us. His parents, Martha and Joseph, became my second family. Martha and Joseph watched over me whenever my mother wasn't at home. As a single mom who was also the only physicist of the town, it was hard for her to look after me while fulfilling her role for the community. Thomas treated me like his own brother, and Joseph was the one who always fixed things around the house. The genuine kindness of this family was something that I held dearly, but everything changed because of what we saw in the woods. As kids who lived in a valley, our playground was the entire terrain that surrounded our home. Just like every other day, we went after our friend Clyde when he wandered around at night on his own. He was the youngest of the group and the one who got in trouble the most. We saw him looking up at the mountains while hiding behind a tree. We were about to sneak up on him, but then we also saw what he was looking at. There were two guys in black suits looking down from the cliff, and Clyde told us that they were roaming around the valley when he arrived. They were too far for me to see their faces clearly, but I could tell that they were hardly moving and just kept on staring at a single spot. As a young boy who didn't know any better, I decided to reveal myself and called them out. Thomas pulled me back as I shouted at the strangers and asked what they were looking at. They probably didn't want to be confronted since my brash actions made them leave. And as they did, Clyde suddenly stormed off on his own once again. We had no choice but to run after him. We went deeper into the woods and we finally caught up with him when he suddenly stopped. He wanted to find whatever it was that the mysterious men were looking at, and he did. Clyde was standing still with his eyes cast down. There was a strange object on the ground, and I immediately got goosebumps all over my body when I took a closer look. This grotesque thing looked like a mummified fetus with inhuman features. It was all wrapped with strips of paper that had writings of symbols on them, but the wrap was already nearly torn. Its little arms were sticking out from the wrap, and it only had 3 fingers on each hand. What intrigued us the most was its tail that had the same length of its body. It was all rough and dry that its skin almost looked like the bark of a tree. It was much smaller than that of a human infant, and yet we could clearly see some teeth in its mouth. Needless to say, I was very creeped out, but at the same time, I also felt a sense of pity for whatever it was. I couldn't describe what I was feeling at the time. Despite of its disturbing appearance, I was so drawn into it that I wanted to touch it. Luckily, Thomas was there to stop me from doing so when he noticed that I was getting too close. Clyde wanted to poke it with a stick, but we immediately stopped him and said that we should tell the town folks about it. Unfortunately, that decision was a horrible mistake. We ran back to the town and told Thomas's father about what we saw. Although he didn't take us seriously, we were able to convince Joseph to come with us into the woods. We showed him where we found this disturbing thing, and we also told him about the 2 mysterious men in black suits. As we arrived to the spot, we were greeted by a couple growling coyotes who seemed agitated by the mummified corpse. However, it appears as if they were too afraid to come any closer. Joseph told us to stay back, but then he suddenly stopped talking. At the very moment when he cast his eyes upon the mummified child, he was frozen in place with a blank look on his face. We kept on asking him what was wrong, but he remained unresponsive and motionless, as if he was deeply mesmerized by it. His reaction was far from what we expected, but what he did next surprised us even further. Joseph daringly charged towards the coyotes and drove them away, and then he picked up the mummy from the ground as if he wanted to protect it. He took off his jacket and wrapped the thing with it as he carried it in his arms like a baby. We were completely dumbfounded by his actions that we didn't even know what to say. Thomas, Clyde, and I kept looking at each other, all confused as we headed back home. The first person who saw us when we arrived was Martha. A fellow townsfolk was accompanying her as she waited for us to return. They scolded us for wandering outside very late at night. We enthusiastically told them about the things we saw in the woods, and we pointed at Joseph, who remained silent all this time. We said that he brought the strange mummified baby back with us, however, he was refusing to show it to them. This made them even more curious, and his wife, Martha, asked him why he was acting this way. As they raised their voices, it caught the attention of the other townfolks nearby. They started to gather around us, and the town's head, Frederick Swanson, saw the commotion. He approached Joseph and politely asked what he was holding, and so he reluctantly revealed the mummy wrapped in his jacket. But just like Joseph, the reaction of the people towards the grotesque fetus was quite bizarre. They were all silenced by the presence of this mummified infant. It wasn't out of fear, but of inexplicable astonishment. Clyde, Thomas, and I were so perplexed by their behavior. They just stood there, motionlessly, with disconnected stares as if they were in a state of trance. They glared at this hideous corpse like it was the most precious thing that they had ever seen. Few moments later, the eerie silence was temporarily broken when the pastor came along. He had a glimpse of the infant's corpse, but his reaction was more reserved than the rest of the people. At that point, we realized that the thing had a strong effect on people. Since the folks didn't want to go away and were obviously more than intrigued with the corpse, the town's head told them to gather in front of the hall. The pastor contradicted and strongly insisted that they should gather at the chapel instead, and so they did. Instead of the obvious questions that should have been raised, such as the identity or the origin of this unusual mummy, the townspeople kept arguing who should keep it. Joseph aggressively stated that he should keep it since he found it, but the rest of the folks strongly disagreed. After almost an hour of pointless quarreling, it was decided that the fetus would remain in the chapel for the night. When Joseph reluctantly handed it to the pastor, we saw some black spots developing on his arm. Thomas was concerned about it, but Joseph ignored his own son and was deeply upset. My mother picked me up before the crowd dispersed. There were too many folks swarming the chapel, and she didn't get to see the corpse. She didn't bother with the reason for this commotion and was just concerned about me. My mother was the last sane adult in that unruly crowd, but even she was not spared when hell broke loose in Swanson's Valley. A few hours after my mother and I went home, we heard a violent banging on the door. There were disturbingly loud yelling and cursing outside, and this kind of uproar never happened before. The town was in complete chaos, and our first share of this horrible nightmare came from the kindest people that we knew. Joseph and Martha were shouting and kicking the door. Mother refused to let them in because of their hostile behavior, but they forced their way in through our window. Joseph's skin had a severe case of gangrene from his hand up to his neck, and Martha's head was bleeding for some reason. Mother and I asked them to calm down since they obviously needed some treatment, but Joseph lunged towards me as Martha pinned my mother on the floor. He kept on yelling and asking me where the mummified infant was, but I was totally clueless. Apparently, the situation escalated when we went home. People wanted to keep the corpse of the child for themselves, and they became extremely violent. They eventually broke into the chapel, but it was no longer there. The townsfolk snapped and lost their sense of morality. They accused everyone of stealing it, including us. Mother desperately freed herself from Martha and kicked her against the wall. She wrapped her arms around Joseph's neck and dragged him off of me. Thomas suddenly showed up and tried to restrain her mother. He was crying and begging for her to stop, but she just screamed like a wild animal. Martha unhesitantly grabbed her own son's head and slammed it on the table. It left a deep cut across his forehead and he began to bleed as well, but he managed to remain conscious somehow. His parents were no longer themselves, all because of a grotesque corpse that we found in the woods. Joseph bit my mother's arm to free himself from the hold. He sunk his teeth with full force until he bit off a huge chunk of flesh from her arm. As I was desperately trying to help her, Martha grabbed a knife from our kitchen and drove it through my mother's chest. Thomas grabbed my arm and we ran away as I was bellowing my heart out after witnessing my mother's horrible death. We saw the townsfolk attacking each other as we ran. Houses were burning and some people were digging the ground with their bare hands for some reason. Thomas told me it was Clyde who took the child's corpse, and he said to the folks that he buried it somewhere. The adults forced him to tell where he hid it, but he remained as stubborn as he always was. They interrogated him inside the chapel. Thomas said he heard him screaming in pain. A few minutes later, the folks walked out the door with blood on their hands, including the pastor. When some of the folks saw us, they immediately came after us. We ran as fast as our feet could take us while screaming for our lives. We were only 2 young children who were trying to get away from this hellhole while being chased by a group of demented people. There was no way that we could both get away. Thomas told me to keep on running and head to the mountains. When he told me not to look back, I already knew what he was planning. He pulled out the mummified infant from under his shirt, and I saw that he also had some gangrene on his skin. It seemed that whoever made contact with the corpse was getting infected by a disease. Clyde gave it to him and lied to the people when they realized that it was driving them mad and inhumanly violent. He was supposed to bury it somewhere in the woods, but he realized that he wouldn't make it. In order to buy me some time to escape, Thomas waved it around so they would chase him instead. He went right inside a burning house and they followed him like a pack of savage beasts. That was the last time I saw my friend, and that was the last time that I saw the town itself. I ran into the woods and up to the mountains. I ran until I no longer could. A family found me unconscious in the middle of the road, and they were kind enough to take me with them. They lived on the next town several kilometers away from my home, and they took care of me until I recovered. I told them what happened, and we drove back to the valley a few days later, but when we reached the side of the mountain, we were stopped by a couple of men in black suits. They did not give any clear explanation and just ordered us to turn back. 2 months later, we went to the area once again. However, Swanson Valley was no longer there. There was nothing but piles of rubble and overgrown shrubs. I will never forget that night. It still haunts me in my sleep. I tried to find out what we found in the woods and why there aren't any records of our town and its community. A decade later, I found an intriguing forum that matched the description of the mummified corpse. The post stated that there are several paranormal items secretly kept and collected by an agency that was working for the government, and one of these items is a mummified body of an unborn child. They said it was a child of a witch who mated with the demon, and they unearthed it after the witch was buried alive. This particular item has the ability to draw people in, especially the adults. They would be deeply obsessed with it to a point that it would drive them insane. Swanson Valley was subjected to an inhuman experiment without them knowing. The effectivity of the cursed item had made them kill each other and destroy their homes. It was clear that the heartless people who orchestrated the strategy made sure that nobody would find out about it. But then there's me, who remembers everything.